So in the talk today, we're going to be talking, as last time we looked at Tekopia as an example of creative problem solving among a society working bottom up. And today we're going to be looking at another island in the Pacific, or a group of islands in the Pacific, and the way that they did the same kind of problem solving, but now looking more top down than bottom up. And our example is going to be the cluster of islands we now call Japan. So Japan was a society in which creative problem solving has worked for hundreds of years. And it is a large cluster of islands. There are 4 major islands: the island of Honshu, which is the big island, and then Shikoku and Kyoku, who are on the lower part, and Hokkaido, the big island at the north. But really it's this whole cluster of islands in the Pacific, and not that far away from Tekopia. And these were, again, it's a very salubrious climate. It's a great place for human inhabitation, but of course had its challenges environmentally. It's comprised primarily of mountainous terrain, very heavily forested, and there was, of course, the necessity for a culture to manage their resources. At the beginning of the time we're talking about now, beginning in, say, the 15th century, there were lots of wars. There were individual kind of landowners that were warlords, and they owned this land. They had peasants that worked on their land. This is the agricultural age. 99% of the people were peasants working for these few warlords. The warlords were fighting each other all the time, and there were huge wars and destruction, and so that kept the population down for quite a long time, but it also meant that the society was not thriving between about 1467 and 1603. And then there was an emperor of the whole area who had not had a lot of power, but in 1603 the emperor designated one of these warlords. They were called daimyos. He designated one daimyo to be the shogun, the kind of king warlord. And he had a lot of power. And it began to centralize decision-making. And it was really meant to reduce the wars, to settle these conflicts and disputes. And that worked extremely well. The shogun was very, very effective. And in the period from 1603 to 1867, which is what we call Tokugawa Japan, there was a real flourishing of the society. And that's really what we're focusing on today. There was a period of great prosperity. There was very little war in that period. In 1720, about the middle of that period, Edo, which was the capital at that time, was the largest city in the world. They were a very, very successful economy and a successful culture. So how did they manage some of these same issues we looked at in Easter Island or in Tekopia? They also had a challenge with deforestation. It was a completely wooded set of islands, but they were building a lot in heavy timber, and they were tearing down trees for that. They were clearing land sometimes for agricultural purposes. That was destroying the forest. They were building their cities, not just their monumental buildings, but all of the buildings out of wood, and the cities were prone to fires. And so sometimes they'd burn down a whole city and then they'd have it to reconstruct again. So the wood had to constantly be renewed. They also were using wood for fuel, for heating, and for cooking. And they used it for fertilizer. They chopped it up and made it into fodder that they could use in their field. So they're using a lot of the forest. And at a certain point, that gets to be a problem. And it really wasn't until 1657 that they got a real wake-up call. In that year, there was a huge fire in Edo, which was the capital, now Tokyo. And that fire destroyed large parts of the city. When they went out to the forest to begin to harvest timber to rebuild the city, oh my gosh, they didn't have enough timber. And they began to realize, whoa, we're very vulnerable to losing this valuable resource that we depend on so much. So the shogun took this on. And that deforestation that they were beginning to see had caused some real problems at that point. It resulted in an increase in wildfires. The old growth forest, the trees were big enough that they resisted the fire, and they just burned the undergrowth, and then the trees regenerated the forest. But where they had new growth, where they were harvesting and they were then growing new wood, the wildfires would come through there, and there weren't any old growth trees to resist that fire, and it would just burn the heck out of it, and the forest would be gone. That often then would cause soil erosion. The roots were holding the soil in place. They have heavy rains in Japan like we do in Texas. That then began, as the trees didn't slow down the runoff and cause it to absorb into the soil, now the water was just rushing across the terrain, and that was causing flooding in the lowlands. And that meant that the river was silting up down below because it was taking the topsoil off of those areas and silting up the rivers. They depended on the rivers for navigation, and now they were not navigable anymore. And again, the forest was something that they depended on for fertilizer, so they were not able to have as good a fertilizer, and it was deterring their crops from as much productivity as they might have. So the shogun's looking at all these downsides of this deforestation and trying to take control of it. And over a period of 200 years, they established actually 12 different things they did to get control of their environmental problems. And these are super impressive. Just amazing creativity that was unleashed to solve these environmental problems. For one thing, they began to increase reliance on seafood and reduce reliance on agriculture. So they didn't have to clear as much of the forest for pasture land or for crops. Instead, they began to use seafood much more. They got new technologies for fishing, bigger boats, better nets, and were able to catch more fish and larger fish. They also put in controls to prevent overfishing so that they were managing that resource well. They also began to, instead of using the fertilizer from the trees, instead they began to take every single piece of that fish, the heads and the fins and the bones, and they would grind them up and realize that that made good fertilizer. So they had fish meal fertilizer instead of relying on the forest for fertilizer. They also began to hunt big sea mammals, whales and porpoises. That meant bigger boats that had to go farther out in order to do that. They did import some food from neighboring places like Hokkaido and Ain. They began to use alternate fuel sources, began to use coal instead of timber for both heating and for cooking. They got much more efficient in their wood construction. They engineered their buildings much more precisely, and therefore were using smaller pieces of wood to do the same job. They also figured out ways to cook in a way that would not require quite so much heat and so much wood for fuel. They reduced the amount of baking and broiling they did and did a lot more stir fry, so more efficient cooking devices. They also heated their homes in a different way. Rather than heating the whole house with big fireplaces, they began to use little coal heaters that they would carry around with them to different parts of the house, and that was consuming much, much less of the kind of timber they had before. They also began to orient their buildings so that they took advantage of solar heat from the sun and needed less heating from other fuel. And they also reduced the reliance on livestock in their cuisine. The livestock, as we saw in Tacopia, it took a lot of vegetables, raising lots of corn in order to feed those cattle, and it was not very efficient agriculture. So they reduced the amount of dependence on beef and pork in their diet and relied much more on fish. So all of these things were things they did culturally, but they did it on a top-down way. The shogun said, okay, these are things we're going to do, and you're going to have to abide by those rules. So through this top-down social and political system, the shogun stemmed the deforestation, and they did two things. One is they inventoried all of the wood they had, and because they were well organized, that was something they could do. And they figured out these trees can be used for timber because they're long and straight, and we'll have a certain amount of them. And these trees can be used for fuel because they're twisty and gnarly, and we'll have a certain amount of them. They inventoried and organized all of that. They limited the amount of wood that could be cut, and they rationed it. If you were going to build a house, you got so many board feet of wood, and you had to figure out how to design your house so that it optimized the use of that wood. You would get so much wood for cooking and so much wood for heating your house, and you had to figure out creatively how you would use that wood to make it stretch as far as it possibly could. They also started a very sophisticated system of silviculture, which is raising trees as crops. And so they began to raise certain kinds of trees that they knew were going to be timber, other trees they knew were going to be fuel. And in a very, very organized way, they developed this forest system. And to this day, I mean, we think of Japan as this urban country, but wow, if you travel around there, acres and acres and acres, just miles of beautiful forest land in Japan to this day. So in Japan, environmental and technological creativity existed alongside social and cultural creativity. They not only, in a technical way, figured out how to do their farming and manage these things in the right way, but they actually changed the way they lived, their culture, significantly in response to this. And there really are two different ways they did that we want to focus on today. And I gotta say, this is so impressive to me, because in solving an environmental problem that they kind of had to solve or suffer the kind of collapse we saw at Easter Island, they had to solve this problem. But instead of taking it as an onerous burden, they were creative and they made things better by solving these environmental problems. And in two ways significantly. One is in their cuisine, which is a cultural kind of thing, and the other is in their architecture, which is a cultural kind of expression as well. So super impressive what they did in terms of cuisine. So as I mentioned, they're relying much, much less on beef and on pork, and they're relying more on seafood. So automatically the cuisine changes. We're not broiling beef. Instead, we're eating primarily seafood, shellfish and fish. And they did limited cooking of that fish. So all of what we now know as sushi and sashimi, it really came out of this era where they're serving raw fish. And that way they don't have the fuel involved in cooking it as well. Two of the most expensive and exclusive restaurants in Austin, Uchi and Uchiko, are both Japanese cuisine. And all of this really delicious, really beautiful food really came out of this period where they were having to not do cooking the way they had before because it was environmentally problematic. And instead they're inventing these new ways of cooking. So sushi and sashimi come out of that. One of my favorite dishes at Uchi and Uchiko are these, they cut beef really, really, really thin. And they do it with fish as well, but I like the beef there. And they cut it really thin, and then they bring a hot rock to your table, and you just sear that thinly cooked beef on the hot rock. So instead of broiling a steak. Instead, they figure out a different way to cook this so that that rock could have just been in the heater, the wood they were using to heat the home. They pull that rock out, and now it's cooking the beef in this very delicate way. The whole idea of a wok came out of this era where you just lightly stir fry something instead of boiling vegetables or broiling beef. Stir frying came out of this. They almost eliminated baking. They had breads before that, but afterwards they decided we don't need bread in our cuisine, so they do very little baking. And they also would often cook with portable devices that they would actually bring to the table. And if you go to Japan these days, especially in rural areas, you can go to these little onsens, these little inns, where you're sitting around the table and they bring your food and cook it at the table. And it's usually some kind of stew. And you can actually decide how many carrots or how many onions or what you want to put in the stew. They bring you the stuff, they have a boiling pot right there. But that pot that's boiling is warming the room at the same time as it's cooking your food. And it's really a wonderful way of eating and serving food, but came out of this necessity for economizing on the fuel that they were using. This even, now often in Japanese homes, traditional homes, they have a kind of well where the dining table is. They always sat on the floor at a low table. Well, now they would stick their feet into this well. They would put the heater down there in the well or the cooking device in the well, and it would heat up your feet, and that would be kind of kept insulated by your bodies. And you'd be warm at the table with very, very little heat, and that heat being used to cook your food as well. They also began to have very seasonal kinds of cuisine. So in the wintertime, you had these stews that you cooked at the table and created heat to warm your home. But in the summertime, you wouldn't have those stews. You'd have something that was raw fish and raw vegetables and things that didn't have to be cooked at all because you didn't want the heat in your home. So it's a whole cultural way of living, way of eating that was made to be environmentally friendly, and in the end produced this cuisine that all over the world is admired as this amazing, really, really delicious food. But it came as environmental problem solving. Now, the same thing happened in terms of their architecture. So at first, before the environmental problems, you see these guys, these daimyos, creating these enormous castles. And those castles are made out of super heavy timber. You can see right there, massive pieces of wood. So there, the very first shogun, Ieyasu, he created a huge castle for himself like this. And he used 10 square miles of forest in order to build that castle because everything's being made out of these massive pieces of wood. So we're seeing a number of the most famous castles in Japan. This one, Himeji, which is made out of those massive pieces of wood. But then they decided, okay, we gotta figure out another way to build here. Now we're gonna engineer these buildings, and we're rationed wood, so we only have a certain amount of wood we can use. How can we use it the very most effectively? And how can we use it the very most efficiently? So they begin to make much more slender frames and little bitty pieces of wood often. And they're making not massive walls between indoors and outdoors, but a connection between indoors and outdoors because they didn't necessarily have to have that massive, heavy wall. And inside, they're creating shoji screens, which is made out of wood, but it's wood made into paper, and then that paper becomes a partition in the house. Much less use of wood than a normal like wood stud wall or something like that. And this begins to then make open houses on the inside, a lot of continuity between the rooms, and continuity between the indoors and the outdoors. So you begin to be very much more in the garden, and that began to make them have very elaborate garden design. And that again is a cultural expression we admire from the Japanese. These beautiful Japanese gardens began to be created. Here in the Austin Botanical Garden, we have a Japanese garden that's a part of that, that comes from this beautiful garden tradition. But that garden tradition came because they had the idea of opening up indoors and outdoors more, that because they couldn't afford to use that much timber to build their houses and have solid walls in between. So garden design began to benefit from the idea of having more efficient and less consumptive use of wood. Now, they began to make whole settlement patterns that were on this basis. So on the steep parts of the mountains, they left the forest there. And they were managing those forests and harvesting the wood from them in a very efficient way. And then where the slope was not quite so steep, that's where they had their agricultural lands, as you can see here. And then down by the water here, very, very efficient towns, very compact, so they're not taking any more land or any more forest than necessary. And you see that all over in Japan. These beautiful occupations of the terrain where the steep slopes are all forest. When it shallows out a little bit, you begin to get agricultural land, and then the village itself is very compact and consuming as little land as possible. So this gets built into a whole way of living and thinking in Japan. Now, what are the takeaways here? We tend to think maybe sometimes solving tough problems like environmental problems, we got to tighten our belt, we got to sacrifice, and you hear this all the time in terms of environmental problem solving in our own society. Oh man, I don't want to have to sacrifice in order to do this. The amazing thing about the Japanese is that in solving their environmental problems, they got a better life. They got a more delicious cuisine, one that has had enormous impact all over the world. They got this fantastic new kind of architecture with much more open rooms inside the house and much more connection to the outdoors outside. And that, in fact, began to have a huge impact on architecture worldwide. The great American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, he was looking at Japan for inspiration for his prairie-style architecture in the United States. He admired the openness of living room, dining room, and kitchen all flowing together. If you grew up in a house where your living room, dining room, and kitchen all flowed together, that's because Frank Lloyd Wright invented that idea. And that idea came from Japanese architecture, which kind of gave an option for more openness inside buildings. The sort of connection of indoors and outdoors, not common in architecture before the Japanese really asserted themselves to do that. And then important later architects like Frank Lloyd Wright embraced that and made that a part of. Now, many of us have homes that have indoor-outdoor connections that are wonderful, and we can enjoy nature in a different way. We make our lives better by solving some of these problems in an extremely creative and productive way. So the takeaway today is there is a possibility of this kind of top-down creative problem solving, where the problem is solved with regulations, with rules, with restrictions. And then if the culture really is creative, they take those restrictions and they invent new things, better things, improvements on what they had before. I think it's an inspiring story. Okay, we'll talk about this a little more in our check-in. Be thinking about it, and we'll discuss the role of top-down creative problem solving. Okay, see you later.